Hello, friends of Renew. I feel like you're friends. I talk to you here almost every day now, talking to them in my little office here. I don't know, I'm just kind of bonding with you. I love you. Well, thanks for tuning in. I hope things are going well. I hope you're having a fantastic day. If you're not, if your day sucks, well then my heart goes out to you. But take heart. Know that in the end, and the end is coming before we know it. In the end, everything's going to be perfect, and if it's not yet perfect, it just means it's not yet the end. Be patient. It's going to happen. So there you go. All right, so we are here at Renew University, and we're in this little apologetics online course where we are looking at Bart Ehrman's essay, What Do We Really Know About Jesus, in Newsweek magazine, December 10th. And we've been kind of critiquing it. If you haven't been along for the first, I think we've done like 7 of these now, is that right? But I would encourage you to actually go back and start from the beginning, because it's kind of a cumulative case. You don't have to. You can do whatever you want. You know, you can push whatever button you want. So, but I'm just saying you might benefit by doing it kind of chronologically. But we are right now focusing in on Bart Ehrman's claim that Luke fabricated the story about this worldwide census as a way of getting Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem when everyone knew that he actually was born in Nazareth. Ehrman claims that Luke's story that Mary and Joseph had to go to Bethlehem because of this worldwide census, he says, quote, cannot be right historically. We've got good documentation about the reign of Caesar Augustus, and there never was a census of his entire empire. Ehrman says that this narrative was designed, and it was fabricated. It was designed to show that Jesus could have been born in Bethlehem, whence the Messiah was supposed to come, when everyone knew, as I said before, that he in fact came from Nazareth. And then Ehrman adds, in this account, Joseph and Mary need to register in Bethlehem, which is why Jesus is born there, because Joseph is descended from King David, who came from Bethlehem. But David lived 1,000 years earlier. Now, catch this point. Is everyone in the entire Roman Empire returning to their ancestral home from 1,000 years earlier? Bart asked. Imagine the massive migrations for this census. And no historian from the time thought it was worth mentioning? Looks like a pretty solid argument, doesn't it? I noted in the previous blog that historians generally give ancient documents the benefit of the doubt. Unless they give us reasons to think that they're lying or are mistaken, we tend to trust them. And we need to, because most of our information about history comes from single sources. And people don't generally not lie for no reason, so it's a good assumption. This is not a courtesy that I see Bart and many New Testament scholars extending to Luke or the other 3 Gospels of the New Testament. But we ought to give ancient documents the benefit of the doubt. I think we also owe it to ancient documents, if I could say this here, to assume that they're as smart as we are. Common courtesy. Assume that they're as smart as we are. There is a sort of prejudice these days, it seems to me, especially in academic circles, to assume that our modern age is smarter than previous ages. Sometimes it's called chronocentrism. It's like ethnocentrism assumes that your ethnic perspective is superior to others. Well, chronocentrism or chronocentrism, whatever, is the assumption that your time period is superior to others, that you're smarter than others. There's just no reason to think that that's so. I go back and read Aristotle, Plato, some of these ancient philosophers. They were as brilliant as anybody in history. I mean, wicked smart, just incredible. Aristotle especially just blows me away when I read him. There's actually some. I just saw this review last week of these arguments that are suggesting that human beings hit our pinnacle of our IQ about 3,000 years ago. That's it. Prior to really the birth of civilization as we know it now. And the reasoning is that in ages past, being smart was a survival advantage and being dumb could get you killed. So we tended to screen out the genes that led to dullness and favored the genes that led to smartness. But with civilization coming about and the way the world has evolved, we no longer need high IQ to survive. And so it's had the effect of kind of dumbing down the entire gene pool. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but it at least means we should assume that ancient authors are as smart as we are. And so here's how it applies to this issue. If something strikes us as absurd, if an interpretation of a story strikes us as absurd, we ought to assume that it would have been absurd to the ancient author as well. And that ought to lead us to look for a different interpretation, a less absurd interpretation. If it's absurd for us to imagine that everyone in the Roman Empire would be forced to return to their ancestral home of 1,000 years earlier, and that is absurd, I'll grant Ehrman that point, well then we ought to assume that Luke would know it was absurd, and that his audience would know it's absurd, especially since, according to Bart, it never happened. And that ought to lead us to look for a different interpretation. It's especially absurd to think that Luke would have fabricated this story involving the whole Roman government and the whole Roman Empire when he knew his audience would know that it never happened. And so that they would know that he's lying. And it's especially absurd to think that Luke would have done this as a way of trying to promote a Savior who is adamantly opposed to fabricating stories like this. And so in the light of all this absurdity, I submit to you that we ought to look for interpretations that are less absurd. Okay? Because Luke was as smart as any of us are. Now, in this case, I think there's an interpretation of what Luke is saying that is readily available. I'll say three things about it. And here I'm going to be a little more detailed than I've been in the past, so you're going to have to maybe take out a pen and paper and jot down a few notes. But here's what Luke says in chapter 2, verse 3. He says, everyone went to their own town to register. Now, most scholars think that meant that they went to the town that they were born in, and that's very possible. But it could also just mean that they went to the town where they owned property and or where they first registered as tax-paying Roman citizens of Rome. So that's what their own hometown means. Luke adds that Joseph went to Bethlehem, the town of David, quote, because he belonged to the house and line of David, not necessarily to suggest that everybody had to find out, their ancestor from 1,000 years earlier and go to their town, but because that is truly absurd. Why 1,000 years? Why not 900 years earlier, or why not 1,100 years earlier? I mean, that is an absurd suggestion. But see, it could be that Luke is just pointing out that Joseph's town happened to be the town of David, and he draws that connection, and that Joseph is a descendant of David, because that's significant to demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah. But he's not suggesting that everybody had to find out who their ancestor from 1,000 years earlier was and where they were born. That is absurd. The second thing is that it's true that we have no record of an empire-wide census being taken. But we do have plenty of evidence of Augustus requiring local regions that had been subjugated by the Romans to take a census as a way of ensuring that everyone's paying taxes and as a way of making sure that they're available for military service when necessary. So when Luke says that Caesar Augustus, quote, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world, many scholars argue that we should understand him to simply be saying, he's making like a hyperbolic statement of the general policy in Rome, that Augustus had decreed that everyone in the Roman Empire would be accounted for the purposes of paying taxes and for enlisting in military service. And what it looked like in Palestine, as it did for other subjugated regions, was that they had to take a census and go to their own hometowns to do so. That's, I think, a much more plausible reading of this narrative than the one that Ehrman offers. Because it doesn't require us to think that Luke was stupid or that he would make up stories that his audience would know were not true. A third thing, and this one isn't mentioned by Bart, although that surprises me because it's a very common objection that's raised against Luke's historical reliability. But it's this. He says in verse 2 that, he says, this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And the problem is that we know that Quirinius didn't reign as governor of Syria until 6 A.D., and Jesus, most scholars agree, was born between around 6 to 7 B.C. And if you're wondering how Jesus was born 6 or 7 years before his birthday, that's because the monk that devised the Christian calendar, some 4 centuries later, was drunk, and he got a couple, I don't know if he was drunk or not, but he got a couple of years off, and so we've been messed up ever since. Okay. So what do we do with this discrepancy? Now, there's several ways of handling this. One is you could just say, well, Luke got that wrong. And that wouldn't particularly bother me. From a strictly historical perspective, That's a real minor mistake. Luke gives us every reason to think that he was a meticulous historian, but hey, to err is human, and his sources could have been mistaken, or he could have misinterpreted sources. It could be an honest human mistake. That wouldn't affect the overall general reliability of his work, and that is what my faith in the historical Jesus is based on, and so that would be no big deal to me. Now, it might screw up, it might mess with some people's idea of inspiration, but that's a theological issue. I'm speaking just from a strictly historical perspective. But as a matter of fact, there really is no reason to think that Luke made a mistake here. There's several ways of explaining this without postulating a mistake on Luke's part. The explanation that most persuades me is been offered by F.F. Bruce, and it's been picked up by a number of scholars since. And that's simply that the word that's translated first in Greek, protos, it can be translated as a comparative before. And so in that case, verse 2 would be translated, quote, "This census was before that made when Quirinius was governor in Syria." In any case, that aside, Ehrman's reading of Luke strikes me as it postulates absurdity to Luke, and that strikes me as unnecessary and frankly unfair. The bottom line is that if we extend to him the same courtesy we extend to other ancient documents, he gives us every reason to think that he is telling us, he's providing us with a reliable report. And I will stand by that. Okay, in the next session, which will be, I think our final session, I'm going to address Ehrman's critique of the allegedly absurd story of the wandering star that the wise men followed. And that will get us into the Star of Bethlehem and some of the astrological funkiness that was going on at the time. It will also take us to the heart of why Bart and many other New Testament scholars dismiss as substantially reliable the canonical Gospels, even though these Gospels pass standard historical critical tests with flying colors and give us every reason to think that they're conveying historically accurate information. We'll find out why that is the case in this next session. God bless you. Whatever you do, 1 Corinthians 16:14, do it in love. If you can't do it in love, don't do it. God bless. Have a good day.